Aloha, namaskar, and hello. Welcome to Climate Change Beyond Outrage, where we go beyond outrage to focus on solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. I am your host, Anu Hittel, broadcasting live from Thinkers in beautiful downtown Honolulu. There are many ways for you to get talking with us. You can join our conversation by tweeting us at ThinkTechHI, and now you can call us at 415-871-2474. Once we're done with the show, don't feel bereft. Join our conversation on our Facebook page of the same name, Climate Change Beyond Outrage. How do you localize, operationalize, and monetize climate adaptation? Today's episode focuses on the intersection between international development and climate change. To help us understand this intersection, we have with us in the studio today Drs. Kem Lowry and Keith Bettinger. Dr. Kem Lowry is adjunct senior researcher at the East-West Center and former chair of Department of Urban and Regional Planning at UH. That's University of Hawaii, Manoa. Dr. Keith Bettinger is a consultant to the East-West Center and the USAID Adapt Asia Pacific Project, and no stranger to ThinkTech Hawaii. They are based here in Honolulu, but work in Southeast and South Asia primarily. Kem and Keith, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. Nice to be here.
International development has gone through several avatars over the decades. It has colonial roots, and with it carries the baggage of imperialism. Even the terms have changed, from underdeveloped countries to developing and now to emerging economies. Remember the old term, third world country? Into this powder keg of politics, clash of cultures, and money, add the layer of climate change, where you have very, very localized problems in large measure induced by a global trend. For this reason, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals established by the UN in September 2015 are a good starting point, but that's what they are, a starting point. From these lofty global goals, we drill down to the very local. So Kem and Keith, for you, you both have been working in this field for many years. What has been most effective, in your opinion, in helping the communities that you work with, and what lessons have you learned?
Well, just to start with, I think it's useful to remind people that when we talked about climate change for the last 25 years, we were talking primarily about efforts to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. So you have the Paris Conference, for example, as an effort to get commitments from countries about the amount of greenhouse gases that they're going to reduce and the period over which reductions are going to occur. The effort in which Keith and I are involved is more about the other end of the spectrum. It's about helping communities adapt to a changing climate. So we have this global effort to reduce emissions, but all adaptation and the impacts of global climate change are local. And they're manifest in flooding, in droughts, in heat waves, in sea level rise, and a variety of other manifestations that occur in different ways in different urban areas. And so what we've been trying to do in the course that we've designed is to help communities of a variety of scales focus on how they're going to, first of all, identify the climate threats that they need to confront, and then to design strategies for coping with those climate threats at the local level.
And of course, so that means that you really are looking at something very, very local. You're drilling down from that global framework, the Paris Agreement and so on, and you're going into local communities. I mean, you said of different scales. Do you have examples that you wanted to talk about?
Sure. The types of adaptation efforts are similar among communities. That is to say, some communities are going to try to build protective structures, dams to prevent flooding or to reduce the impact of sea level rise. And other communities are going to try to accommodate to sea level rise in having hazard maps where they don't allow development to occur, or in raising up structures so that they're less affected by increased flooding, or to actually retreat from shoreline areas, to speak of sea level rise in particular as one of the most prominent impacts. So the types of strategies are similar across cities, but the particular choice of tools, of adaptation tools, is going to be locally specific. So what Jakarta does is going to be different for what's useful in Hanoi.
And so you've worked in some of these areas, and we had some examples in Manila, for example, when you talked about sea level rise. We have a picture of the stilt houses and so on. Is this something you could elaborate on for us?
Well, this is an example of the kind of informal settlement or squatter settlement that occurs around the fringes of most of the giant cities of Asia. And it occurs in part because there's this influx from rural areas of people who want to take advantage of all the city has to offer. They're looking for land where they can settle and build houses. And the lowest, most flood-prone, the least desirable land is often where they settle because access to it is much cheaper. So these are many of the people who are most vulnerable to the hazards that climate change brings because of floods, because of typhoons, and lots of other threats as well.
Right, and then, of course, some of these are things we see here in Hawaii as well.
Sure.
Maybe not in the same scale, but certainly these are impacts we see here as well. And that we have sort of, for example, the coastal setback issue here as well.
That's right. So in Hawaii, both the city and the state have started down the path of trying to design adaptation strategies. And you mentioned setbacks. The island of Maui and the island of Kauai have both adapted new setback lines that are further in from the shoreline as a way of reducing the exposure of new construction to increasing sea level and to storm surges and hurricanes. So those setbacks are can be thought of as part of an adaptation effort.
And so are these adaptations that you see, of course, some of them are planned by the state, and it almost seems like the state is kind of playing catch up in many cases, right? People have already started adapting and so on. And what are the kinds of localized adaptations that you've seen across the board?
Well, some of the things have been around for a long time, but we're talking about them in terms of climate change. So we have flood maps, for example, and within those designated flood zones, you have to have more stringent building codes, and that's been around for a long time. Those flood zones have recently been expanded, and that's a recognition that climate change and more intense storms are likely. And so that's a reflection of the need to be more conscious of the areas where flooding is likely to occur. So that's one example, but there are other examples of things that are beginning to be considered, like relocating some facilities. We recognize now that some highways on the North Shore of Oahu, for example, are exposed to episodic flooding much more frequently. Out on the North Shore, you have those houses where the beach has been scoured out because of a big winter wave. So that's the kind of impact that we will see more of, and so we'll have to have strategies to adapt to those kinds of impacts over time.
And of course, the state is going to need to help plan as well, and so that's a little bit more.
That's right, and there's
not just for the planning, but for getting resources to those projects.
Exactly.
Right, and so I know that we have some pictures about some of these localized adaptations and so on. And Keith, did you want to talk about those?
Well, what the pictures that are coming up now are from an interesting encounter that Kem and I had when we were working in Manila, in the Philippines, and we had the opportunity to visit a neighborhood of informal settlement, squatter settlement, near a river that runs through Manila that's frequently flooded. And what they've done in this area, we were guided around the community by a city councilman or a neighborhood councilman. an elected official there, and he's really become a champion in that neighborhood for climate adaptation and for resilience and for disaster risk reduction and for actually taking the bull by the horns in terms of all of the threats that the people are facing. So this is a low-lying area, and as we saw earlier with the still houses in Manila, people living in these places is a manifestation of political economic processes that are taking place at the local and the national level in these places. Now that's a big part of climate change, or the impacts of climate change. So earlier we mentioned about how you localize things in terms of climate change, and I guess that goes back to one of the basic differences between climate change adaptation and traditional development. A lot of development, as you know, is prescriptive. Yeah, the Millennium Development Goals, for example, are prescriptive. This is what we're going to do. We're going to improve education, and you do that across the board. Climate change adaptation, the impacts of climate change they're a combination of physical processes that change from place to place. Right, they're influenced by local topography, water currents, all sorts of physical characteristics, but they're also shaped, right, by these political, economic, socio-cultural characteristics. And what we see with the people living in the vulnerable areas is, well, there are processes that are pushing them there. So part of adaptation is understanding those processes and coming up with interventions that address those processes that put people in harm's way. So what our new colleague in Manila had done is he had a very acute ground-up, bottom-up understanding of what made people vulnerable, what made his compatriots vulnerable, and so he was taking the lead in addressing at the community level these drivers of vulnerability. So they were doing kind of conventional things like elevating electrical and water pipes up above the flooding level. But another interesting, an interesting, I guess you'd call it adaptation strategy that they had pioneered there was they were reclaiming land on the other side of the river and developing urban gardens in these places. This is land that was zoned for an expensive, here we see a picture of it, for an expensive development, and that development had been sidetracked by a flood about 5 or 6 years ago. Now, what this was designed, this was supposed to be large houses, right? It was supposed to be for relatively wealthy people. Now, the development process slowed down a little bit here, and what our colleague, what our barangay councilman has done is basically claim this land, and they're building gardens for elderly people. They're building gardens for children. They're managed by different user groups, and what these do is they create a food supply, right? They also help people diversify their incomes because they can sell the produce at the market. And it's a very, it's a bottom-up solution that comes from the people themselves. And so what Kem and I work on trying to do is enable those processes rather than being prescriptive, rather than telling people what to do, is, we want to unleash the power of what we call autonomous adaptation and collective adaptation. These are things that not that the government is doing, but that people are doing on their own because they have the best understanding of what they need.
Right, so you're really trying to address that capacity building through this seeking solutions and so on, and that's what we will talk about. We have only, we need to take a break in a second here, but when we come back from the break, we'll go into that and talk more about what your projects actually do and your course. So don't go away. We'll be back in a few seconds, and we will talk more about how to foster that solution seeking for climate adaptation. This is Climate Change Beyond Outrage. Don't go away. We'll be back.
Aloha, this is Maria Mera, and I'm here to invite you to my bilingual show, Viva Hawaii on Think Tech Hawaii, every other Monday at 3 p.m. We're here to inform, motivate, and entertain you. Join us. Hola, soy María Mera y estoy aquí para invitaros a mi show bilingüe Viva Hawaii en Think Tech Hawaii cada 2 lunes a las 3 de la tarde. Estamos aquí para informaros, motivaros y entreteneros. Apuntaros.
Aloha, my name is Justine Espiritu, and I am the co-host of Hawaii Farmers Series. This is my co-host, Matthew Johnson, and we are live with you every Thursday at 4 p.m. at thinktechhawaii.com. And our show focuses on Hawaii's local food community. We feature not only the farmers that are producing our food, but we also feature the supporters and other folks involved in the community that are trying to promote local agriculture.
Welcome back to Climate Change Beyond Outrage. And here we are in the studio with Kem Lowry and Keith Bettinger from the East-West Center. And we're talking about solutions to climate adaptation, really looking at fostering some of this solution seeking rather than telling people what to do when climate events hit them. And so really, some of the capacity building work that you've been doing, that's, as you mentioned, it's not, you're trying to get people to figure out the solutions, you're trying to beef up their capacity. Tell us how you actually, through your projects and through your courses, you have a fantastic course that you teach to some of these communities, and tell us a little more about those lessons and how that has helped them.
I think a big part of it, of our course, and of course it's Urban Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience course, and it's geared at kind of second and tertiary cities in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and also across the Pacific.
When you're saying secondary and tertiary, so you're talking about like how big are these?
Well, in places like Indonesia, for example, Jakarta is by far it's a primate city, and it not only does it kind of dominate the politics and the economy of the country, but it has more resources and expertise available to it in addressing not just climate change, but any kind of urban problem. Now, secondary cities would be Surabaya,
Semarang.
Semarang, Lampung, or tertiary cities as well. And these are,
right.
It's different than the United States. The United States has a number of kind of first level, first order cities, but most countries in Southeast Asia do not. And you can really see there's a disproportionate availability of resources in the large capital cities, and in some cases secondary and tertiary cities are neglected, and so that's what we kind of consciously target those areas. So in India, some of the cities in India would be
Can't think off the top of my head, but I think of
Mysore is one city that we work with in India, and like that. But the first step, I think, is we're looking at the assumptions, right? So we try to recognize local expertise and local understanding. So we go back to the point that adaptation is local. And so the information that you need to develop in an adaptation strategy, we refer to that as bottom-up information, as opposed to top-down information. A lot of times with climate change planning, there's a bias towards looking at projections for the future, what may happen in the future, and in many cases, the cases that we work with, these projections are not available or they're hard to come by. So when you think about the existence of this adaptation gap, the people are already kind of 2 steps behind. And it does not really matter what happens in the future if they're dealing with an adaptation gap right now. So instead of looking at this top-down information, or we combine that with bottom-up information, recognizing community needs from the people themselves. That's important to do. They have the expertise there, but in a lot of places we find that there's not a strong tradition of the government listening to or tapping into those sources of information or involving a broad range of stakeholders. It may not occur to them to do that. And so that's where we start, is bringing as broad a base of stakeholders to the table as possible. Yeah.
And so it's really, you're trying to help build those civil society channels. And is that what your course focuses on?
Well, we, just to give you a quick example, one of the courses that we did was in Maumere in the far eastern end of Indonesia. And we were the course was primarily for local planning and policymakers and academics. And they decided that they wanted to make that the climate change impact they were most concerned about was drought. And so they broke into small groups to think about what the manifestations of drought were and how they might begin to intervene to reduce the worst impacts of drought in the community. So that wasn't necessarily where we would have begun, but that's what they chose. And so that's how we worked around it. And so the next strategy was to think more deeply about, okay, what's combining to worsening drought conditions, and how can we begin to think about reducing the worst impacts of drought over a 2-day period. So it was working like that. And in Mount Mary, we worked with a local team, a group from Kota Kita, which is a non-governmental organization. And so the course was delivered in Indonesian, and then Keith and I were helping in the evening to work through the material that they'd identified during the day, and then working with the small groups during the day as well to think about, how you think about which of the areas that are most heavily impacted, and how you create maps and all those kinds of things that are part of developing an adaptation strategy.
When you say creating maps and so on, is that sort of your problems tree and your objectives tree, or are you actually talking about maps?
Both.
There's a number of tools that we use, a number of steps.
Yeah.
But the objectives tree and the problems tree, just kind of building on what Kim was mentioning about drought in Malmedy and the eastern part of Indonesia, the Philippines flooding was an issue. The issue depends on the area. One of our goals is to get people to think about the problem that they want to address. So, for example, droughts an issue. It's a process, and there are different types of drought. There's hydrological droughts, meteorological droughts, etc. But is a problem that you want to solve drought? Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, because you can't. You will have drought. That's a new status quo, basically. So rather, what we want to do is kind of tease that apart and see what are the impacts of drought? What are the primary impacts of drought? What are the follow-on secondary impacts? What are the cascading impacts of drought? And are there things in this bigger picture that we can address, that we can develop adaptation strategies for? So then you start to kind of help people understand, and it's really gratifying to see them come up with these things on their own after some facilitation. Right. Water management strategies, right? And in the local context, not just, we need to manage our water better, but people are really thinking about how we actually are using water in our region or in our city, and let's think about things that how we can improve the governance, how we can improve water management, things that we can do on the demand side, things that we can do on the supply side, et cetera, to address this. So what we're seeing here, this is a mapping product, and this is from Makassar in Indonesia, and we scrolled through several maps there. This is a vulnerability assessment. This is one of the things at the policy level, at the strategy level, that we work with local governments to do. And the vulnerability assessment is essentially a baseline survey of climate change impacts in your locality. In this case, it's a municipality. And the reason why this is important practically, it's a strategy document, but what it does is it informs funding proposals later on. So virtually every climate adaptation fund, any development fund really, the project needs to be couched in terms of a broader strategy. So the first step in actually obtaining resources to address a problem is to develop this strategic framework. And so we go step by step into how you do a vulnerability assessment. We talk about, how do you measure, how do you map exposure? Exposure is pretty easy. That's just if you are coming in contact with a threat, right? If you could potentially be flooded, then you're exposed to that. There's some things like food security, food shortages or droughts. It's a little bit more difficult to map exposure, but that's our first step. And then we go into sensitivity, right? How sensitive to you are you to this exposure? And we look at that, we combine that with exposure, and we get an impact score. And then we measure adaptive capacity. And you come up with proxies, you work with the people that your participants, you work with your stakeholders to come up with proxies for sensitivity, for adaptive capacity. And what that does is it starts to help people to understand and visualize different ways other than expensive infrastructure ways to build adaptation and resilience at the local level. And so it's kind of a a shift in thinking about adaptation and moving away from this development paradigm where you're building things, right? To adaptation where you're not just building things, but you're improving institutional capacity, autonomous adaptive capacity, and collective adaptive capacity, as we mentioned earlier.
So to think of an example that might be familiar to some people, Katrina is a good example with which most people watching would be familiar. And there, the area exposed was all the low-lying areas that were going to be subject to flooding once the dike broke. But we're also concerned about, Keith mentioned sensitivity, and in this case you might think of those who are most likely to be vulnerable, like people who are disabled and can't get out of the flood-prone area, or older people, or people without transportation. And when you map that as well, you begin to see that there's some pockets of the city where there are likely to be great impacts. And Keith mentioned the concept of adaptive capacity. We also want to see how well people are going to be able to respond to the threat. So people who don't have the money for alternative housing or don't have food, clothing, and shelter have, to use that term, low adaptive capacity. But the people who could get in cars and drive to Houston, we're set. And so we need, as we begin to plan for slow-moving disasters like sea level rise and short-term risks like hurricanes, we need to think about all these things and to think about how we could reduce exposure or sensitivity, increase adaptive capacity, and all of those are elements that we bring into the course in the context of the local example that people want to work on.
So you've worked in this field for a while, and over the years, have you seen changes in actual climate events and so on, and the need for that adaptation? Or have you been seeing that all along in these last, say, 30, 40 years?
Well, there's a well-established field of disaster risk resilience, and climate change overlaps greatly with that. So to the person living in a settlement like the one we saw in Manila, they don't care whether it's climate change or disaster risk resilience. Many of the tools are the same, and this has been going on for a long time. There are now reports that say that climate change means greater frequency of intense weather events like hurricanes. And so the level of preparedness and the need for strategies to reduce exposure and sensitivity are probably greater now than any time in my memory. And I think that's evident from all the headlines you see about the frequency of typhoons in the Philippines and Vietnam and Hong Kong and things like that.
Right, so of course, all of this begs the question is, how is this all going to be funded? And when we come back from the break, we will talk more about monetizing this process and where do these resources come from. So even though the world has gotten richer overall, there are still pockets, the inequalities, I should say, are greater. And
right.
That is something that we'll talk about. Essentially, I see international development and development aid sort of going towards reducing those inequalities. And we'll come back to talk about that in a few seconds. So don't go away. This is Climate Change Beyond Outrage, and we'll be back.
Aloha, I'm Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and I host Sustainable Hawaii at thinktechhawaii.com, which streams live educational and civic engagement on the internet and Oceanic Channel 16. I love doing this show because it's an opportunity to be able to share some of the good news as well as the pressing issues for Hawaii and the world about climate change, climate justice, and sustainability, and the need to start employing and continue to request sustainable policy initiatives and actions on the part of our decision makers here and abroad. So I hope you'll tune in with me every Tuesday from 12 to 1 p.m. as we try and engage you, share a lot of very interesting people's work and perspectives, and perhaps turn you on to taking action for sustainability. Mahalo and aloha.
Aloha! How you doing? It's me, Angus McTeck, Wishing you to welcome and join us to see us on Hibachi Talk on Think Tech Hawaii. Join my co-hosts, Gordo the Tech Czar and Andrew the Security Guy, every Friday from 1300 to 1345. We look forward to seeing you. We'll talk tech and we'll have some wee bit of fun. And remember, let your wing gang free wherever you be. Aloha!
Welcome back to Climate Change Beyond Outrage, and I'm Anu Hittel. I'm in the studio with our guests Keith and Kem, who have come from the East-West Center talking about climate adaptation in Southeast and South Asia. And so we'll talk a little bit in this segment about monetizing that process. Where are the monies coming from? How do they get to folks, to the projects themselves? The Green Climate Fund, of course, is the big one that's out there these days. It will bring $100 billion US dollars to the pot every year for climate mitigation and adaptation. To date, we have about 10.3 billion pledged by all countries, by some countries, I should say. And what does this mean? So for context, let me show you what that 100 billion actually means. And here's a slide that, an image that shows you that what have we pledged so far? 10 billion, and Americans spent about $7 billion in 2013 alone on potato chips and 83 billion on beer. So that's about $90 billion, which is practically the Green Climate Fund every year. So potato chips and beer. Keith, is throwing more money at the problem the solution, and what do you see as challenges for climate financing in the regions that you work in?
Throwing more money, that's a really good question.
Or buying them more potato chips and beer.
I don't think that that's a solution, but maybe that simplifies the problem a little bit. So according to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the treaty, there's a treaty obligation there for developed countries to provide new and additional funding. That means above and beyond current expenditures on overseas development assistance to developing countries on for climate change mitigation and adaptation, right? So that so that the developing countries can chart a path forward towards green development or low carbon development, but also so that they can deal with the ravages of climate change. And so that's in the treaty, and the reasoning behind that is because the developing countries have not, historically they haven't contributed as much to the problem. And so here we are, we just had COP21, we're 21 years after this treaty, and we're just operationalized the Green Climate Fund. And right now, as you mentioned, it's at about $10 billion, $11 billion, which is a significant amount of money. And the idea, and they just in late 2015, they just approved their first round of projects, 8 projects, for a total of $165 million, I think, is how much they have granted or they have used in concessional financing and like that. But like you said, that really is dwarfed by the amount of money that we spend on beer and chips, but it's also dwarfed by the need, right? So there have been a number of studies that attempt to quantify, I'll focus on adaptation because that's what we do. There's been a number of studies that attempt to quantify adaptation needs. In the future, the World Bank has done this. United Nations Environmental Program has done this. The Asian Development Bank has tried to quantify how much money will be required for adaptation in its client countries in Asia Pacific, and it's really difficult. Everybody recognizes how difficult it is to quantify this. But according to the World Bank study that was released just 2 years ago, I think by the year 2030, and again, I think that these numbers are meaningless, but by 2030, the World Bank says that adaptation costs could reach $150 to $300 billion a year. So there's a recognized need, and again, this is also in the UNFCCC treaty. It's in the Green Climate Fund's bylaws. It's in the Adaptation Fund in their documents. There's an understanding there that the amount of money no way matches the need. So we're never going to get there. We're never going to get there. But the problem, that's not the big issue. The problem is, how do you spend this money? So when you talk to people that are associated with implementing these projects for the Green Climate Fund, or with the Asian Development Bank, or the World Bank, the project people, there's a lot of money to be spent, or through the Adaptation Fund, for example. There's a lot of money to be spent, but the way that adaptation works, it kind of follows the development mold. There's procedures, and the countries that want to access the money have to follow the rules, right? They have to demonstrate readiness and accountability, that they have certain fiduciary standards, that they're able to govern the money properly, that they're able to put together a project kind of in the vein that the Asian Development Bank, that the World Bank, that the Green Climate Fund wants to fund. Right? So this is not just an issue of giving Nepal or India or Indonesia going through the border and giving them a briefcase full of, $100,000 bills. That's not how it works. You have to have a fully developed project. And
Right.
so from what we see is that there's a big gap in creating actual projects that would be eligible for funding. Now, part of that is a lack of capacity, maybe at the national level, but another part of that, I think, is the rules. Right, the Green Climate Fund has some pretty detailed rules that have to be followed, some stringent guidelines and procedures for entities that want to access Green Climate Fund resources. So it's not just the amount of money, but channeling the money where it needs to go.
Right. I mean, it's, $10.3 billion is not very much when you think, oh, we spent $7 billion on potato chips.
Right.
But it's still more money than we've seen ever, perhaps, in this field, right?
Mm-hmm.
In adaptation, climate adaptation
Sure.
specifically. And so really looking at how does this money get down to the project levels, to the local levels that you're talking about, to not even the city itself, but settlements within cities and communities within those. How does it get down to that? Is that something that you've thought about, that you're dealing with?
Well, one of the things that Keith's research has shown me is that most of the money in the near term is going to come from national resources, existing national resources. So before they can tap the Green Fund and other funds, they will be spending their own money. So the challenge is how to spend that money most wisely so it has the biggest impact on the threats that they're already facing. So, for example, we see those images of flood-prone areas, and we see in Manila and Jakarta that flooding is already a huge problem. Well, one obvious answer, because there's such a bias toward infrastructure, is to improve the drainage. But if you really want to reduce flooding, you've got to go in the upper watershed and reduce the amount of forest harvesting that's going on, and planting on watersheds that increases the runoff. So there are things that can be done now with existing resources about building retention basins in the upper watershed, and reducing cutting the trees, and a variety of things and building standards, for example, creating more green surfaces so the water can be absorbed when there are new developments, instead of putting parking lots everywhere. So these are fairly simple, fairly inexpensive measures that could have a major impact on reducing the level and intensity and severity of flooding in the lower watershed. And those can be done out of some local resources before you get to the other more expensive projects.
And are you optimistic that those kinds of things would happen in these governments and these communities, or is that something, even though it's simple to do, is it really that simple?
This field attracts optimists. People who think that
Yes.
human behavior can be altered and improved, and want to participate in that effort. So I think we're engaged in this because we think these are problems that can be addressed and solved, or at least mitigated.
Right, and I guess what I'm asking is that it's going to require quite a bit of coordination amongst different entities, different planning entities,
Right.
City governments. If you're looking at watersheds,
Right.
you're going to need people to coordinate with those jurisdictions. How much of that actually goes on? and will go on, especially perhaps with sort of Green Climate Fund monies dangling out there?
Well, we see already that the push toward greater interorganizational collaboration and planning is happening in a lot of these cities. And you see these task forces that some of which are working well in some cities and not so well in others, and partly they're being induced by the pressure of both national and international funders. And that's a good thing. That's a positive development, I think, and I think that's something that we can point to. But when we talk about capacity building, we're talking about skills like the ability to do cost-benefit analysis, but we're also talking about the skills of collaboration and the skills of creating collective efforts to address some of these problems. So capacity building covers a broad spectrum of activities.
Another thing about that, I think you have to be optimistic about it, but also when you think about the actual issues that you're trying to address, well, the more intense hurricane or rising sea level that's the big picture issue, right? But you're not trying to stop the hurricane,
right?
You're not trying to hold back the sea, so to speak. You're not trying to reverse that process. You're trying to adapt to it.
Just dealing with it.
You're dealing with it, right? Not just coping, but adapting, putting yourself in a situation where you can continue to prosper and thrive in the future.
Right.
And for me, that's a lot more promising because the tasks associated with that are things that we can do. These improvements in institutions, strengthening institutions and processes of governance are things that we can do. Now, not only, and what makes me more optimistic about it is not only does that address issues of climate change, but it improves governance. And so it provides all sorts of co-benefits in terms of economic and social development across the boards. So I mean, from my perspective, that's optimistic, but realistically optimistic about it.
And that's a great way. We've got a couple of minutes left on the show, and that's a great way for me to segue into asking either or both of you if you have any sort of final messages that you would want to give to our viewers about your work.
Well, I don't think there's any one single thing. We're encouraged by the amount of national and international interest that there is in this topic. And Rockefeller Foundation, for example, has started this big 100 Cities Resilience Project, and they're making big investments both in helping cities become more resilient to climate change, but also in funding research and planning assistance for these countries. So as we look around, we see that there are lots of efforts, and that's a particularly dramatic one. So there is a shift in recognition of the problem and a willingness to take on these adaptation problems, and also a recognition that it's not just about new infrastructure. It's about a broader set of skills and approaches.
Thank you. And I think that's a good way to, it's a very hopeful message, and certainly with a problem that's as intractable as climate change, you know, I really appreciate that hope. And really, in the end, we're also talking about the work that you're doing is really dealing with poverty and the inequalities that exist. So thank you for doing that good work. And I will just end with a quote from Nelson Mandela. It doesn't directly have to do with climate change, but as we know that climate change does affect the most poor in the worst way. So he says, "Massive poverty and obscene inequality are such terrible scourges of our times in which the world boasts breathtaking advances in science, technology, industry, and wealth accumulation, that they have to rank alongside slavery and apartheid as social evils." And so I think this is, you know, it's really encouraging to know that we are working towards a solution, and that's what this show is all about, is highlighting the solutions, not the disappointments. And to that end, actually, I want our viewers to remember that it's Earth Day on the 22nd, on Friday, and that's when the Paris Agreement gets, there's a ceremony for signing, and so follow us on our Facebook page, Climate Change Beyond Outrage, and come back on Tuesday at 1 o'clock. We will be here. Thank you very much, the two of you, and thank you very much, viewers, for being here with us. Aloha, namaskar, and goodbye.